And we'll go ahead and start with Christina today. If you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you think you're a good candidate for this position.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name's Christina Stephenson, and I was born and raised in Oregon. I'm a mom, I'm a small business owner, and I'm a civil rights attorney. And I'm running for labor commissioner because I actually fundamentally believe that Oregon should be the best place to live and work in this country. And look, I know that's a lot, but it's only going to happen if we elect people who actually believe it. So my day job is I represent workers who are getting a raw deal when their employers are not following the rules that are enshrined by the Bureau of Labor and Industries. So at this point, I've spent tens of thousands of hours with the law that is regulated by this agency. So what this looks like is workers who have had their wages stolen, hundreds of workers with their wages stolen, workers who have been sexually harassed on the job or been victims of race discrimination. And it looks like a whistleblower case where my tiny law firm went toe-to-toe with Wells Fargo, billion-dollar company and its army of lawyers, and we beat them in court. And I'm proud of that. And I also own and operate a business, a business I started at the kitchen table when my son was just 3 months old. So I know what it means to make payroll, the salary, the taxes, the benefits. And whether it's that terrible time in March of 2020 that was really scary as a business owner, or a banner year, I know what it means to pay my employees well before I pay myself. And the way I think about it, the labor commissioner's role is to make sure that all the workers, the employers, the side hustlers, the dreamers, everybody who makes our economy run, they know they have someone in their corner, someone who's looking out for them, who wants them to win. And that's the promise I want to uphold as the next labor commissioner.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, Casey, you're up.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the invitation. First of all, some of you know me as being joyful and enthusiastic. In fact, I think Christina probably understands that by now with the conversations we've had. But I am going to be a little bit more somber because I've been thinking about this a lot in light of COIN. And I ran for county commissioner in 2018 because I saw and I knew so many county residents that were left behind, disregarded, and unable to achieve justice, whether that was keeping their trans child safe or keeping a dump from expanding onto a neighboring field. And I was determined that with my farmer hat on and my science degrees tucked into my pocket, I could help them find a measure of justice and the ability to live a safe life in our county. And we have been successful at that. I was telling the folks, the organizers earlier, that with my local indivisible group, we fought for a needle exchange, which is now in its 3rd year and is directly related to dramatically lowering sepsis cases among Medicaid patients. And for mandatory cultural competency training for health workers. And now we can hold management at the county accountable for treatment of staff, and we can hold staff accountable for the treatment of patients. And with our local land use watchdogs, I denied expansion of a leaking garbage dump run by the largest garbage company in the world. With our with disabled hunters, I worked with Weyerhaeuser to open gates that were leading to public land so that everybody had access. But what haunted me most as I think about this were the folks who didn't find justice for that harm that was done to them, especially when I sent them to the state. So bias crimes and intimidation against a lesbian neighbor, no justice. Refusal of a business to print ally posters for the P-flag group, no justice. The whistleblower who got fired, no justice. Every time I sent a hurting person to the state only to have them ignored or discounted, my heart really ached. I felt like I'd failed them. And so I thought about the success that we'd had at the county by organizing, by pushing, by listening to staff and getting them the tools they needed. And I realized that I could do this at the state level, that I could set up BOLI to be the #1 civil rights watchdog and really hold people, businesses, employers accountable and help people to achieve justice. So the formerly homeless person who was evicted again, they need to have recourse. The whistleblower who retaliation claims were never investigated, they need to have justice. So I have the tools and the experience as a county commissioner to do the work of rebuilding BOLI. And I have the track record of working with unions and businesses and management and the public to really build a more just community. But ultimately what I've realized is it's actually about democracy. Every time a state agency fails one of us, one of our neighbors, that's one more crack in the foundation of our democracy. So I want to thank you for your time beforehand. It's really good to be with all of you. And I look forward to the questions.
Thank you both. And the first question, you both alluded to this in your introductions, but tell us what your understanding of what a labor commissioner does and what would be your top priorities as labor commissioner. Christina, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question because a lot of people, frankly, don't know what this agency does, even though it's the chief enforcer of civil rights in our state. So the top 4 things that BOLI does, so when I say BOLI, I'm talking about the Bureau of Labor and Industries. And so the top 3 things is enforce the civil rights of Oregonians in the workplace, in housing and public accommodations. Next, enforce the wage and hour laws of the state. So that's your overtime, meal and rest breaks, prevailing wage as well. Number 3, provide technical assistance to employers. So, you can call up BOLI and say, hey, how do I comply with these laws as an employer? And then number 4 is BOLI regulates the apprenticeship programs. So it's responsible for delivering a high-skilled workforce for our industries here. And in terms of my top priority, of course, you've heard I have a ton of experience in enforcing civil rights laws, and that is going to be a priority, as is, at this point, we've got working families and small businesses that are struggling with rising costs right now, inflation. And we have an opportunity, I think, to deliver for people a pathway to a better job through our apprenticeship programs. So people think of our apprenticeship programs in the building trades, and we have a lot of strong apprenticeship programs, but we also have an opportunity to expand them because we have so many workforce shortage issues that, really it's a workforce crisis in industries like healthcare, education, high-tech manufacturing. So it will be really important for us to expand that model. And it's a tried and true model, earn while you learn. It's much more accessible. It's a great way to diversify our workforce and get people into family wage jobs. So that's going to be my top priority.
Thank you. Casey, same question for you.
Yeah, and Laura, if you don't mind, I think that Christina did a great job of laying out the role of BOLI. There's not a lot of confusion about what BOLI does. So I'm going to say that I'd rather focus on the things that I'm going to prioritize. And it's 2 sides of the same coin, is that most people, as the question suggests, don't know what BOLI does, but bigger than that, they don't really know what their civil rights are. They just know when something isn't right. But then many people do know what their civil rights are. I listened to a man the other day who told me all about a whistleblower retaliation. And he said, I need to go to BOLI because they enforce anti-retaliation laws. So my one side of my priority is communicating to the public, which I do a lot as a county commissioner. And we were talking with Debbie, Kathy Schwartz at Wasco County is really good at the communication. I like to think I'm good at it too. But the flip side of that is that when somebody then comes to BOLI, they need to know, they need to trust that we're going to give them a fair and just outcome, that they'll feel heard, even if we don't get everything that they need in order to make them whole again. And so what that requires is really making sure that staffing levels increase, make sure that staff have the tools that they need. And really this will be going to the legislature and making sure they know how important it is to reduce caseloads at BOLI, so we have good investigations and low case counts. And I think we can go from there. I don't need to take up the whole 2 minutes.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to take turns asking questions. So my turn. So Casey, you'll get to go first on this one. So we had this issue at the start of COVID with the unemployment checks getting out in a timely way. And so the question really is, have there been upgrades, or what has been, what kinds of things can be done to keep this type of thing from happening in an emergency again?
That's such a great question. And well, I will say that first, the employment department is separate from BOLI, but we work together closely. And what we saw at the employment department was a delay and a delay and a delay in reinvigorating and redoing their IT infrastructure to handle the 2010 caseload, not even to handle our modern equivalents of internet. But so the real problem there was not a sense of urgency and having a computer system that was just not capable of the massive influx of people. And I saw the not emergency because I was in meetings on a weekly basis with our regional partners, because I was the chair of our county during COVID. And so what we really need to do, is to make sure that BOLI has the tools necessary to do the work. And that means updating the IT infrastructure. We can actually learn from the employment department by making sure that we have a system that works well for complainants, for respondent businesses, and for staff, and frankly for the public, because it's hard to find information. And the other thing is to impart to the legislature a sense of urgency about the work, that long wait times are unacceptable. I heard from somebody recently who was waiting 8 months for a call back from BOLI, 8 months on a retaliation and whistleblower complaint. So impressing upon the legislature that we have an urgency and getting them to fund new staff and new IT infrastructure is the really important part to me.
Cool, great. Okay, Christina, same question.
Yeah, Casey's right. The Oregon employment department dealt with the unemployment checks, and one of the opportunities I think in this position is having better coordination between the different agencies. I mean, for example, I know in my practice that when people have just been terminated, they often don't know that they are qualified for unemployment. And this is something that, you know, folks showing up to BOLI, they've also just been wrongfully terminated. So terminated based on a protected characteristic. And so, you know, when the need is obvious, our response should be obvious too. I mean, this could make the difference between somebody making rent and not. So connecting them with the obvious resources of the state is a priority of mine. And then we also are going to be having paid family medical leave insurance coming online. And so this is something that I, you know, in my free time, what I do for fun, go down to the legislature and help get things passed, like paid family medical leave insurance. And so now it's going to be coming online. It's also going to be at the employment department, but BOLI is going to have a role. Just another, you know, kind of right without a remedy. The enforcement is the key. So allowing people to utilize that leave without fear of retaliation is going to be really important. And I'll tell you, I mean, these are complicated laws. If you look at the Oregon revised statutes in this area, I mean, it's probably 3 inches thick, 10-point font, double-sided. And so we have right now a number of different laws that regulate leave. So we have sick leave, Oregon Family Medical Leave Act, and then we're going to have the overlay of paid family medical leave, where there are areas that are not, they're not coextensive. So something will be protected under paid family medical leave, but not under OFLA. And so these are complicated pieces that I think it's important that we have a commissioner with experience in the law.
All right, thank you both. And we'll start with Christina this time. And this is kind of a related question, but can you give us some specific ways that you see BOLI being able to improve access by employees to information and assistance, benefits, and for hearings? So what kind of improvements need to be made in order to improve access by employees?
Yeah, I understood the question to be how do we improve access for hearings? Is that right? Or
for any information about assistance, benefits, and hearings?
Okay. So in terms of how the BOLI process works, you know, from an employee's perspective, not from the employer's perspective. So what happens is a person first goes through an intake process with BOLI, and then eventually a complaint is made through that process. The person signs it, then it's filed, and then they're assigned an investigator. And the investigator will have an interview with that person. They'll ask the employer, who is the respondent, to tell us in writing what your response is to all of this. And then there may be a chance for a rebuttal interview where the complainant, the employee, talks to the investigator about, okay, this is what the employer said, this is my response. And that's kind of the basic process. The investigators will also call witnesses, look at evidence, document those sort of things. That's what an investigation looks like. So it is very, very rare for a case to get all the way through to a hearing. Because if you've made it to a hearing, what has happened is the Civil Rights or Wage and Hour Department has determined that there's substantial evidence that what you allege has occurred, and they've made a determination. It's very similar to criminal law. You have a prosecutor who says, okay, I'm looking at this file, I think there's enough evidence here, I'm going to go now to administrative law judge and present the evidence and see if this judge agrees with me. So this is a very small percentage of cases, though, that get all the way to that point. So in terms of accessibility of all of the information that comprises BOLI as a worker, there's certainly more that can be done. It's gotten better. I mean, as somebody who's had BOLI on speed dial for 10 years, been using this website, watching it change over the years, it's gotten better, but plenty of room for improvement in how a worker encounters the information, because like I said, the universe is large, right? And so our job is to make it simple. I'm a worker, I go on the website and say, okay, I'm in this industry, it's public or private, there's this many employees, this is the type of work I'm doing. These are the laws, these are your rights. That's what we need to do to make it simple so that they can understand, okay, I've got an employer with 6 or more employees, I am entitled to pregnancy accommodations. I didn't know, I wasn't sure. And we have to make that easy for them to know their rights.
And I will say, you don't need to ask the question again. I'm happy to jump in here. So as I alluded to in my second answer of my priorities, communicating fully to the public in a statewide campaign that's grassroots, basically like the Indivisible Network, where you're talking to people you trust, right? So somebody speaking in the language that you understand, in the place that you are comfortable with, is a very important part of getting people to the point where they know about BOLI and they know what their rights are. The flip side of that, though, is that we really, really need to have BOLI be better at communicating with the people who come to us. So one of the most common things that I hear from folks who haven't received what they felt like is a just outcome from BOLI is they didn't know what was happening. And Christina alluded to the many steps that are involved in it. But if somebody has gone through the intake process of filling out the questionnaire, and they get a call from somebody at BOLI, they don't know what step they're at. They don't know, am I going to wait that 8 months for somebody to call me back with a formal investigation? They don't know, am I at the stage of an intake or am I at the stage of a complaint? They don't actually know that part. So having the staff at BOLI have the tools that they can use to communicate with a complainant and frankly with the business or the employer is also very important. And that I know it's silly, but I have a lot of experience with the IT infrastructure of communicating well with people, and having a better IT system and a dashboard for people is a very important part of it. But I will say the flip side is that in many communities, micro communities, niche communities, communities with different languages than English, having a website and having a dashboard is a barrier that's hard to overcome. So having people be able to communicate with each other in the languages that they recognize, but not having to go to a website all the time for is an important component of really improving access for people to the process.
Thank you.
And thanks, Laura.
Oh, okay. So we had a number of questions about unions, including one in the chat just now. So I'm going to try to combine these into one or two questions and ask you to answer them. We'll start with Christina. Maybe talk a little bit about your experience working directly with union membership and what unions you have sought out in terms of endorsements or endorsements you've received in this race. And also, what would you do to support more unions in the workplace, assist in the organizing of unions, if that's possible as labor commissioner? Talk a little bit about that. And then finally, what role do unions have in BOLI? What, in terms of enforcement of wage and hour or workplace discrimination laws, or in the worker training and apprentice programs? And I'm happy to break that down.
Okay, I'll try to remember all of that. You know, I'm proud to say that I have the support of, dozens of unions. So the Oregon AFL-CIO, Oregon Education Association, Oregon Nurses Association, firefighters, all SEIU. So representing hundreds of thousands of workers in Oregon. So in terms of how I've worked with them in the past, you know, like I said, you know, one of the things I have done for fun is just go down to the Capitol and try to make workplace laws better. So, for example, working on pay equity, working on drafting the Oregon Workplace Fairness Act, paid family medical leave, like I talked about, pregnancy accommodations, OSHA retaliation law, you know, the list goes on. And so they have seen that I'm very focused on making sure that our workplaces are free of discrimination. I mean, really simply, that isn't that what we want here in Oregon? And so I'm proud of that support. And in terms of how unions can kind of be involved, there's a couple of different ways. One is a really exciting partnership with SEIU, where in the apprenticeship division. So they've started a CNA apprenticeship program for long-term care workers. So this is a place for BOLI to be much more nimble and kind of thinking outside of the box, which has been starting to happen. And so, you know, delivering on those partnerships is a great place. And then the other thing, you know, in the enforcement realm. So, you know, we have talked, you know, you've heard that BOLI is desperately underfunded. I mean, we're talking probably about less than half of the staff it had 40 years ago. And of course, Oregon's only gotten bigger, right? So that is why I'm really excited about this model. It's called strategic enforcement, and it contemplates the exact situation we have right now, which is, you know, limited resources. And one of the components of strategic enforcement, and there's many, but one of them has us partnering more with folks on the ground. So with community partners, partners like the COON, the Farm Workers Union, and hearing directly from our most vulnerable and marginalized community members who, frankly, this is where BOLI is most needed, you know, for those workers. So communicating directly with them and hearing, you know, tell us about the housing, tell us about the pay. We've got farm worker overtime that just passed, you know, that's going to be a huge issue. So, you know, we can't just wait for a complaint. I mean, we know that it takes a lot of economic security to make a complaint. I mean, frankly, you have to be empowered in a certain way. And I feel like that's BOLI's role, is to kind of give cover to the folks that are so vulnerable that they're not going to be empowered to make a complaint. So that's a great place for us to be partnering with unions.
Thank you. Casey.
You know, I could talk Oh yeah, I could talk for an hour, and Christina and I could still not overlap in terms of there's so many points to this question, but I will attempt to like not overlap. So I work closely as Yamhill County Commissioner. I'm ultimately the executive of a county with a 700 employees and a $175 million annual budget. That means that I work with 8 different bargaining units. One of the biggest one is 350 employees. I work very closely with both the hired union leadership and the elected union board. I have very strong relationships with all of those unions, and those they supported me in my county commissioner race. They have chosen not to support me in this particular race, and I'm totally fine with that. And I've explained that it's very important to have, as Christina knows, it's very important to have an open relationship with the unions where they know to come to you when there's a problem before there's a problem. And that's what we did a lot of at Yamhill County, is working closely with them so that problems didn't develop. I will say that one of the other roles that unions have already right now is that there are union-backed apprenticeships that the Bureau of Labor and Industries is in charge of supervising and registering. And I say supervising because they have a role in making sure that all apprenticeships meet the standards that are set, and that apprenticeships are actually graduating people, so that you don't enroll in one and then 7 years later wonder, wait a minute, I spent all that time and I haven't graduated yet. So it has there are a lot of components to it. Christina touched a lot, for a moment at least, on the enforcement component. And I will say that, as you've heard now from both of us, the Bureau of Labor and Industries is chronically understaffed for the work that they're trying to do. And so unions have a very important role for their members in bringing issues to BOLI that are basically an investigation that's already been done. They say, here you go, here's what we found when we did our work because of this injustice here. And so I will say that right now, one of the problems that we have at the Bureau of Labor and Industries is that you really only get attention if you have an attorney bringing your case, or you have a union member, your union representative bringing your case. And so for the people who don't have an attorney or don't have a union member, they are, as Christina noted, the most vulnerable, because they're going to have to wait a long time to really get the attention of an investigator at BOLI. And how do we solve that? We solve that by having more staff, by letting the legislature know that there is a crisis here at the Bureau of Labor and Industries. And we could go on, but there's so many questions that are piling up in the chat.
There are.
Piling up in the chat, and we have all the questions we already have too, which one of them is, this is for you, Casey. So jobs, new jobs to Oregon, are new jobs through BOLI just through the apprenticeship program, or is there other jobs that BOLI can be involved in?
Great, that's a great question. So the Bureau of Labor and Industries, the Apprenticeship and Training Division, has the responsibility of overseeing specifically apprenticeships, but they have a responsibility to work with the Higher Ed Coordinating Council and workforce boards that are around the state in order to make sure that all training programs that are outside of higher ed are meeting high standards. And so I'm on the executive committee of our local workforce board, which uses federal and state money to train people who have either lost their jobs or who are youth. So we do youth, and we do people who are either chronically unemployed or newly unemployed. I want you to know that this was not really all of the question, but to add to it is that it's really hard work to do workforce training. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of money, and it takes a lot of listening to trainees to find out what their success is, their measure of success, rather than just what federal or state dollars accountability says is the measure of success. And we can go into that more, but I wanted to note that it should be person-centered, and it isn't at this point.
All right, Christina. Thanks, Casey.
I do think, beyond the role of expanding the apprenticeship model to get into, more areas like childcare, places where it's not a surprise that we're going to need a highly skilled workforce, a well-trained workforce to do these jobs, nursing and things like this. That is definitely BOLI's role. But I think, the commissioner also has a convening role. You have a statewide vantage point. And so you have the ability to see, models like in Hermiston, where their kiddos have, one of 6 CTE, career technical education tracks that they're involved in. And now the legislature has allocated $1.5 million to a pre-apprenticeship program there in Hermiston that I think will be, a good kind of model for us to see how that does, because we would love to have our kiddos, in these CTE programs, because they have better outcomes regardless of what they end up doing, even if they go into apprenticeships or not. But then we can get them into, but if we do the apprenticeship 16, 17-year-olds and then a seamless pathway right into the apprenticeship programs, so that the kids have exactly the skills they need. They don't have to go get extra training before they're into the apprenticeship programs. And we can see hope, the hope, I think, in the Hermiston model is the kids will actually, find jobs in Hermiston, stay in their own home communities and be able to contribute there. And so the labor commissioner is going to have that vantage point and hopefully, some convening power to help replicate models that are working.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, you kind of touched on in your answer there to the next question. So I'm going to kind of modify, well, the next question was actually 3 questions together. So I'm going to kind of modify that a little bit. But in general, COVID has really shown us that, there are a number of workers who just aren't satisfied with the jobs and the wages that they were earning before COVID. And so we want you to talk a little bit about what you think you can do as labor commissioner to help kind of create or work on that imbalance in income that we see so much in Oregon, and things like raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour statewide. Do you have some plans for kind of spreading that around and increasing wages for those who are traditionally lower on the salary scale? Oh, I'm sorry. Christina, you're up first.
Okay, so in terms of, the $15 minimum wage, I mean, I think that we're seeing that that's not even vaguely sufficient in most of our communities. And we're also seeing that people aren't taking those jobs either. So they are starting to raise, the market is demanding higher wages. The workers are demanding higher wages. And the role that the commissioner plays is in making sure, there's dignity in all work, right? I mean, if somebody chooses a job, we're not making value judgments about those choices, but we are going to make sure that their workplace is free of discrimination, free of the sexual harassment and free of the wage theft that we see our most vulnerable workers being subjected to. I mean, just to give you kind of a sense of the scope of the problem, 6 years, 2013, 2019, substantiated wage claims. So these are people who the state says, yes, these wages were stolen from these employees. Only 16% of those had any penalties assessed to them. So that means the vast majority of those cases, the workers just basically gave their boss an interest-free loan. You don't have to pay me. I mean, that's just the basic, right, is people getting paid. And of those substantiated wage claims, only 1% of those penalties were actually collected. So we have a long way to go to make the existing jobs that people are doing safe and make sure they're paid.
And there were many parts to that question, but I'm happy to just jump in after Christina. The wage theft issue and the lack of penalty is a very big concern. And hopefully many of you saw in the Oregonian. Christina, did you see the article in the Oregonian today? You could just raise your hand or nod. So the Bureau of Labor and Industries has reached an agreement with a number of district attorneys to allow them basically the authority to pursue criminal penalties against employers who have intentionally withheld wages, and it's an escalation, but it's really coming out of this this reporting of 16% of valid wage claims as having penalties assessed and only 1% of them being collected. So this is a move in the right direction. I will note that at least the district attorney from Multnomah County has many times explained that he has a very high caseload. And so I do have concern about his office's ability to take the next step on this. But it's really good to see a strong enforcement face going outward, because it is a public relations thing as much as anything, that deterrence is prevention, right? So if you say, I am leveling a penalty against an employer for an egregious violation, it deters. And we know that it does. It scares employers into doing the right thing, which they shouldn't have to be scared into it, but it happens. And I will say that on the wage side, we've touched on it a little bit, but high skill training that we do at our workforce partnership right now, that there's $200 million for an unprecedented amount of money that came from the legislature, and 20 million of that is going to the apprenticeship division at Boley to support apprentices and to set up new apprenticeship programs, is a way for people who have low skill job or have low amounts of training and low wage jobs, that they can increase their training so that they can seek out higher paying jobs. So there's these two different ways to do it, is to be effective on enforcement and to make sure you're following through on retaliation claims as well. But on the other side, really building a high skill, high wage workforce.
Thank you. So now we want to flip to the other side, the employer side, and I want to start with a question about small businesses that we got. What would make it easier for small businesses to comply with state regulations for payroll withholdings? And beyond that, there's just a number of statutes and regulations that small businesses must learn about and comply with. And so what do you see the role of Boley in helping small businesses comply and making it easier for them to comply? And Christina.
Well, as a small business owner myself, I have to comply with all these same rules and regulations. I mean, honestly, I remember, when you sign up with your business Secretary of State, they send you this, 167-page. And all they say about Boley, they tell you about all the different things you got to do. And all they say about Boley is, hey, go get your workplace posters there. Which is true. Yes, Boley makes these beautiful workplace posters, but it's so much more, right? I mean, there's a technical assistance division that any employer can call up and say, gosh, I don't know what to do, and that is a huge resource for our employers. So even just knowing about that, and frankly, it's just it's hustle is what it is. You got to make the connections. You've got to be out there, Chamber of Commerce and letting people know that this is something that exists for them. And then once they know it exists, the technical assistance is wonderful, but also, the evolution of the website, and of course, we do want to be communicating with all of our businesses. We have businesses that folks that are speaking other languages, using other forms of communication. I mean, could we send a text message? Just upgrading our ways of communicating and thinking about it so that people know that this is a resource. Because look, there is a firewall, between the technical assistance and between enforcement. So our employers need to feel really comfortable that you can come to us regardless. And that's kind of the trust I want us to build, is that employers actually come to us when they've made a mistake. You know, when they have made a mistake and they say, oh gosh, how do I fix it? You know, that's the level of trust I want us to have. And yes, simple. It has to be simple. I know, you know, as a working mom and a business owner, if like, give me bullet points, give me, you know, flow charts, whatever it is to make it easy for people to comply. That's that's also how we make a dent on the enforcement piece, is by giving our employers the tools they need to do it right. So, and from my vantage point, it's a very unique vantage point, right? Because I also, you know, I advise businesses, but I also prosecute these cases for employees. So I see where the weak spots are. I mean, I see where, gosh, if we could just give employers, I won't get too much in the weeds, but certain forms on these issues that come up really, really regularly, that would save a lot of complaints from even happening in the first place.
Thank you. Casey?
Yeah. And Christina and I think, but maybe Christina would disagree. I think both of us are coming at this. We are coming to the same place from different perspectives and different experiences. And so mine actually comes from working with a state agency very closely, the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission, because I was one of the first state licensees in the licensed cannabis market. So for those of you who don't know what cannabis is, it's pot. So I was a pot farmer from 2016 to 2021. Get my dates right. And so I started at the very beginning when regulators and regulated had no idea what to do. And as Christina noted, we were given the state statute. Like that was our instructions for how to comply with thousands and thousands of requirements. And so what we learned over time with a back and forth was that communication was very important, like proactive communication from the regulator and the regulated, as you noted, as Christina noted, in a way where we knew we weren't going to get in trouble because we were just asking a question. And so we got to the point where with a lot of back and forth, there was trust between the investigators and the regulated, the licensees. And then we even proposed and had passed by the legislature what we call a safe harbor. So for a certain number of requirements, because there's a lot of requirements, is a very heavily regulated crop, and we had a safe harbor. So anything within that bubble of laws, we could actually go to basically we could fix them rather than getting a penalty. And the OLCC is much more quick to do penalties than BOLI is. So we were used to be facing a penalty or a loss of license, and instead the commission said, let's find ways for you to just fix this and then tell me you fixed it. And boy, that's a really good way to build trust with a business, and in this case a lot of small businesses. So that's my real experience with working to actually make things better for small businesses. I will say on the flip side of it, because the Bureau of Labor and Industries does so many different things, I have a team member who's ready to be our business liaison, so that they're a person who already has trust with business communities around the state.
Thank you. So I want to talk about retaliation. Despite the legal protections, it's very difficult for employees to come forward to file complaints about breaks and not getting leaves and sexual harassment and discrimination. And the reality is it can be very easy for an employer to retaliate. So what do you say to that? And what can BOLI do to improve the protections for employees against retaliation? And I want to also reference a question in the chat about that, especially if the retaliation involves something physical or threatening. Is there some kind of 24/7 hotline that BOLI provides or could provide? Let's start with Casey this time.
Okay, I was going to jump in, but I was looking for unmute buttons. I saw the question in the chat, and I think it's a really important one. It really is a situation where the Bureau of Labor and Industries needs to be directing people to their local law enforcement for if there's a risk of, if there's a physical threat involved. But I do think it's a really good idea to have somebody that people can call with these retaliation complaints, because there's such an important component of having a society and a democracy where we have trust in the systems. So having somebody that they can call right away is an important component of it. I will say that from the folks I've heard who filed retaliation complaints with the Bureau of Labor and Industries and not had a satisfying result from it, didn't feel like they were heard, they didn't get resolution, it was usually because they didn't hear back. And so this really points to the communication need, is that if you're not hearing back from an investigator at BOLI, you just don't know what's happening. And retaliation is a very time-sensitive thing. It's often you've been unjustly laid off and you're trying to figure things out. I heard from a man who was evicted from his the farm housing because of a retaliation. And so he was homeless in Central Oregon. And he didn't know when BOLI was going to call him back. So improving that response time and thinking of it as really an emergency, a crisis that we need to get response time down. And that will take money, it'll take staff, it'll take support, it'll take challenging staff and giving them the tools necessary to do the work, and also letting them know that it's a priority of the commissioner. It's not an overnight thing, but it's really important.
Christina, what do you say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have probably dozens of retaliation protections under state statute right now, but any of these laws are on the books are completely meaningless if they can't be enforced, right? So actually having people have good outcomes with BOLI is the top priority, but also just the nuts and bolts of this is retaliation under the law. What it usually looks like is something like someone's been terminated, right? So I was terminated for making a safety complaint. I was terminated for complaining about sexual harassment. It looks like demotion, somebody not being hired into another position, perhaps. Those are kind of the bread and butter types of retaliation, but the law also protects things that affect the terms and conditions of your employment. And so any of us who have worked know that retaliation can feel like you feel it, right? You experience retaliation, even if I haven't been terminated, but you've been retaliated against. And so I would like our investigators to be, thinking about retaliation a little bit more holistically, because even though it's a little bit harder under our legal standards, it is protected under the law. And I think that people, that needs to be recognized. And with the, physically threatening sort of retaliation, I mean, it's horrific. And of course, we would want them to be going to law enforcement, but we would also, again, when the need is obvious, our response should be obvious. We should be letting them know about, you have crime victims leave, maybe it's DVH, there's harassment and stalking leave. So if you've been a victim of assault, harassment, stalking, domestic violence, letting them know that, right? Because if they've just been in a situation where they've been in a physical altercation at work, they've called the cops, they're actually entitled to protected leave as well, right? And who should be telling them that? It's certainly BOLI. And then, people don't think about this that often. When they think of OSHA, you think of unsafe workplaces in certain physical conditions, but it also includes the sort of workplace violence that we're seeing an unfortunate amount of. And so that's another tool where we need to be coordinating with OSHA and say, look, we also have a workplace violence issue, which is something that you should be investigating.
All right, we're going to go to another question. Systemic racism is something that seems to be another part of the workplace. And so how does the actions of BOLI help that? I mean, I think we've kind of touched on that a little bit with retaliation, but just to know, acknowledging that it exists is the very first step. So do you as a candidate understand that systemic racism exists in our institutions? We'll start with you, Christina.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, systemic racism is baked into basically all of our institutions, and that includes bullying. I mean, I'll tell you why I got into this field actually was to get at systemic racism. So, you know, my second summer of law school, what I did, I went to this place called the Center for Constitutional Rights, and we worked on a class action that was aimed at a discriminatory screening test. So this is a test that firefighters had to take in order to be qualified to be firefighters in New York. And this test, all that it did, the best thing it told you was perhaps someone's socioeconomic status, but it had a disproportionate effect on people of color. And that is discrimination. That is a type of discrimination. And so we fought that test and we won. And I really thought that it was an important way to get at systemic racism in our institutions through the law. And so that is the perspective that I'm going to bring to BOLI as well.
And I'm happy to jump in. I was like, oh, who gets to do this first? So Debbie and I were talking before we started here about Wasco County and Yamhill County, and having a 1 commissioner on a 3 commissioner board. And what I've learned in being in the minority of power at the county is that we have systemic racism, and we have to figure out how to talk about it with people who don't think it exists. And so what that looks like in a system where people fight against it every day is that instead, as a leader, what I've done is to say, okay, how can we in this county right now get funding to minority-owned, specifically Hispanic-owned businesses where people don't actually have citizenship? So during the early pandemic, they weren't able to get any assistance from the state or the federal government. So we were able to craft programs at the county level that helped people really in the face of systemic racism. Another thing that we did at the county is, and I alluded to this in my opening statement, is that it was a brawl, and Sheila, who's on here right now, and Elise and Chris actually know about this. We instituted a mandatory training for staff at the county to teach them essentially about the existence of systemic racism. And it was a tool to increase people's knowledge and understanding, but it was also a tool for holding people accountable, because they can't after that say that they don't know it exists. And it's a very effective way at starting the conversation about having a safer workplace that actually fights against systemic racism every day in structural ways. And so that's what I bring to the BOLI commissioner. I also work very at a statewide level on the side, because Christina's like, well, I've got this on the side. I also have the on the side, which is active transportation and transportation justice in the, and what that looks like is walking and biking and safe ways to get around communities without having to be in a car, because a lot of people can't afford to be in a car, right? It's a lot healthier for them to be able to get around on foot, and it's a lot less money. And so I do a lot of work in that realm on systemic racism as it shows up in our transportation systems. And so the work that I've done there, I bring into this work of BOLI. And we also know, and I will say that there's institutional and structural racism baked into our, sounds out here, into our state agencies. And we've seen that there's currently a hostile workplace complaint and a lawsuit against the Bureau of Labor and Industries by a staff member, and we just have to deal with it. And my plan, alongside working with people on the lawsuit, is to actually bring in folks to look at the agency and find out what ways can we make this better, and how can we open and cast a light on institutional and structural racism as it shows up in the Bureau of Labor and Industries. Sorry, long answer. And it started with Debbie.
Well, we have to leave the questions there for tonight, but I do want to give each of you a chance to add anything that we didn't ask that you'd like to tell us about. And I'll start with you, Casey.
Sorry, I was looking in the chat because there's so many good questions in the chat, but we did get to some of them. And I will say that, so my experience and my work as a county commissioner gives me the tools and the experience to really do the work of supporting staff at this crucial state agency at a very important moment when we have high caseloads and we have distrust all across the political spectrum that really is eroding the foundations of our democracy. And I believe just that firmly that if we can find justice for people at BOLI where they feel heard, they feel like their cases are resolved, that we will be putting the bricks back in the wall of democracy, of really supporting a system and a bedrock that you all are part of in your organizing work. And I will say thank you very much. Thank you for COIN. Thank you for Progressive Yamhill being part of COIN, because we uphold each other every day. And thanks for your time.
Thank you, Casey. Christina.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming out, because, you know, this is the agency that enforces civil rights in our state. I mean, this is an important job, right? And so I really appreciate that you're taking some interest in it. I'm proud to say that I've been endorsed by the last 5 labor commissioners, and I am, you know, this is what I feel like I was sort of made to do, right? I'm a civil rights attorney, I'm a small business owner, I have the perspectives of both sides and am going to be able to empower both sides of the coin. And, you know, my plan at BOLI is, you know, we're going to train the workforce of the future through our innovative apprenticeship programs. We're going to enforce the laws of our state, you know, protect our workers and hold bad actors accountable. And we're going to empower our good employers to do the right thing, give them the tools they need to comply with the law. Because, I mean, really, you know, whatever industry you're a part of in Oregon, you know, healthcare, manufacturing, tourism, you know, Oregon makes you promise, you know, if you work hard and you play by the rules, you're going to have someone in your corner. And that's the promise I want to uphold as the next labor commissioner.
Thank you very much. Before everyone leaves, we have an announcement